Hello, good day class. This is Julian Marie F. Morales, and together with Rona Cabreros, Johanna Dampios Garciano, Naya Tricia May Olitres, and Sheena May Rojas Talaget are going to report the topic that we will discuss for today. So, morning students, we are going to discuss the chi-squared. So, what is a chi-squared test? Chi-square is a statistical test commonly used to observe data with data we would expect to obtain according to a specific hypothesis. It means that this is a test performed viability of the hypothesis up to what extent can it be true. So before conducting a chi-squared test, we need to formulate a hypothesis, which is the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. And after that, we are going to observe the data with the data we would expect to obtain. So this test, the purpose of this test is to determine if a difference between observed data and expected data is due to chance, or if it is due to a relationship between the variables you are studying. So this is the formula class. Ang x squared is the chi-squared. Nga equal sa sigma symbol, which means the sum, and inside parenthesis, we can see nga naay observed value minus expected value with squared. Nga sa denominator ani niya mo ni siya ang expected value, which is ato i-divide. So the first example is flipping a coin. Ang null hypothesis nato dire is that the coin is fair, while ang alternative hypothesis is the coin is biased towards in favor of heads. So ang sample size nato aning example is 10. So out of 10 ka flips, nag-expecta nga amo gawas kay 50-50 ang chance, which is 5 ka heads o 5 ka tails. Karon nga nag-flip na ta, ang nigawas man noon, which is the outcomes, kay 9 ka heads o usa ka tails. After formulating a hypothesis, we are going to solve the chi-squared test using its formula in order for us to have the chi-squared value. So, diri sa tamag una sa heads. Ang outcome sa heads kay ang 9 minus sa expected data sa heads, which is 5. 5 giapon ang sa denominator. Meanwhile, ang sa tails, ang outcomes is 1. Minus same giapon sa heads, which is 5. So, giunsa man pagkuha ang 3.2. So, 9 minus 5 is equals to 4. And then, ang 4 squared kay 16. So, ang mahimo na siya 16 over 5. So, dili na sadta sa tails. 1 minus 5 is equals to negative 4. Ang negative 4 squared is mahimo na siya positive 16. Kay negative times negative is equals to positive. So, ang tails kay same gihapon sa heads, which is 16 over 5. So, since wa pa man tanaw man, di ba? Ato i-divide ang numerator nga 16 ug ang denominator nga 5. And ang atong makuha ani kay ang katong 3.2. So 3.2 plus 3.2 is equals to 6.4. So mao na ni siya ang atong chi-squared value.
Okay, so after knowing the chi-square, compare the calculated chi-square value x squared with the critical value. Critical value is found using the chi-square chart. P-value is located on the top square chart. So classmates, ighuman na to og kuha sa chi-squared value. Ang sunod nga buhaton ana kay imo i-compare ang chi-squared value sa critical value. Ang critical value is makita nato sa chi-squared chart, which is kanang naka-blue, while ang p-value is naa sa taas, which is kanang 0.10, 0.05, 0.02, and so on. Degrees of freedom. Number of outcomes minus 1. Okay, so para makuha nato ang degrees of freedom, mao ni siya ang atong buhaton. Example, when flipping as a coin, it only has two outcomes, which is head and tails. So since duha ang outcomes, ato siya minusan og 1 para makuha nato ang degrees of freedom. Okay, so mo na naka-indicate dira ang 2 minus 1 equals 1. Ang 1 mo na siya ang degree of freedom. P-value, measure of the strength of evidence against the null hypothesis. Mao ni siya ang atong gamiton to determine ang strength of evidence or ang probability level against sa ato null hypothesis. Smaller p-value, test is significant. Larger p-value, test is not. Significant may have owned by chance. If the p-value is less than 0.05, reject the null hypothesis. So meaning, kung ang nakuha na to nga p-value is mas gamay pas 0.05, then we can reject the null hypothesis. So kung dako ang p-value sa 0.05, so we fail to reject the null hypothesis and accept na lang sa alternative hypothesis.
So class, this is the chi-squared chart. Ighuman kuha sa chi-squared value, ato pangitaon ang degrees of freedom, which is katong gisulti ni Miss Rona nga, number of outcomes or observation minus 1. Since flipping a coin man ato example, so duha man ang outcomes, diba? Which is ang katong heads o tails. So duha ka outcomes minus 1 is equals to 1. So ang degrees of freedom nato kay 1. So since 1 man ang atong degrees of freedom, so diri ra ta sa first row ha, magtan-aw, which is kaning mga 2.7, 3.841, 5.024, and so on. Take note class nga ang pinaka main point nato ani is ang kaning 0.05, especially kaning 3.841. Kay nga naman, kay kung mas gamay pa sa 0.05 ang critical value nga atong nakuha, meaning we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Pero kung mas dako pas 0.05, then we can reject the null hypothesis. Nakasabot ra? Balik ta sa example 1. Ang chi-squared value kay 6.4 and ang degrees of freedom kay 1. So tan-awon naton sa chart kung mas dako pa ba or mas gamay ang 6.4 sa p-value nga 0.05, which is ang critical value kay ang 3.841. So ang 6.4 kay duol na sa p-value nga 0.01, which is ang critical value kay 6.635, meaning the p-value is lesser than 0.05. Therefore, we can reject the null hypothesis nga the coin is fair.
Example number 2. Another example gyapon ni flipping a coin. Probability would be 50/50, but the outcomes were 53 heads and 47 tails. So, ang expected value naton kay 50/50, but ang atong outcomes or ang observed value kay 53 heads and 47 tails. So, aton siya i-calculate gamit ang formula. Ang formula kay chi-squared equals the summation of observed value minus expected value squared over expected value. Next nga buhaton kay i-substitute ang mga given numbers. So chi-squared equals the summation of 53 minus 50 squared over 50. Then i-add nimo atong ikaduha nga observed value, which is ang 47. So plus 47 minus 50 squared over 50. Sunod sana, i-minus na naton. Chi-squared equals 3 squared. Kay 53 minus 50 kay 3. So 3 squared over 50 plus 47 minus 50 kay negative 3. So negative 3 squared over 50. So ato na siya sa kwintahon. Next kay among ning chi-squared equals 9 over 50. 9 kay 3 squared equals 9. Then plus negative 3 squared equals positive 9, no? Okay, negative 3 times negative 3 equals positive 9. So, 9 over 50 plus 9 over 50. So, sunod nga buhaton kay i-add nito sila. Chi-squared equals 18 over 50 kay 9 plus 9, 18 over 50. Then, imo na sila i-divide, ang imo makuha ang answer kay chi-squared equals 0.36. So, ang chi-squared naton kay 0.36.
Class, the chi-square is 0.36 and ang degree of freedom kay 1. Ang p-value ani is larger than 0.05 and we fail to reject the null hypothesis, meaning we still don't have enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, which is 50-50 daw ang chance kung mag-flip kag 100 times, since the relationship found in the sample is likely to have occurred by chance. Kay duol-duol naman ang outcomes sa expected data.
So now, we are here on our third example. Our null hypothesis is that 50 over 50 of the sample size of the school likes English, while our alternative hypothesis is that girls likes English more than the boys. So before we proceed, we need to know what is null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis assumes that there is no association between the two variables, while the alternative hypothesis assumes that there is an association between the two variables. So here, we have the given datas. So the observed value of the girls are 13, while the boys are 7, and the expected values of both girls and boys are 10. So we use our formula, which is chi-squared equals the summation of observed value minus expected value squared divided by expected value. To substitute, chi-squared is equal to the sum of 13 minus 10 squared over or divided by 10. So, mao ni siya ang sa girls plus 7 minus 10 squared divided by 10, which is maupod ni siya ang sa boys. So, after, chi-squared is equal to 3 squared over or divided by 10. So, why na 3 squared man? It's because nag-minus ta. 13 minus 10. So, we got 3. Nya ang squared. So, we have 3 squared divided by 10. So, plus negative 3 squared divided by 10. So, why na negative 3 squared man? Kaya if we subtract 7 sa negative 10, 3 man ang makuha kay mas dako man ang 10 sa 7. Next, mao gihapon. Chi-squared is equal to 9 divided by 10. Kay 3 squared is equal to 9 man. Plus 9 over 10 or 9 divided by 10 gihapon. Kay ang negative 3 squared man, mahimo naman positive, which is mao ni ato nakuha. 9 over 10 or 9 divided by 10. Then, chi-squared is equal to 18 divided by or over 10. Kay 9 plus 9, kay 18 man. Nya after, ato ay i-divide ang 18 sa 10. Mauni nga ang ato chi-squared kay 1.8.
Ang chi-square is 1.8 and ang degree of freedom is 1. And ang p-value is larger than 0.05 and we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Take note that the null hypothesis is always stated in the negative. This is because you have to be able to prove something that is indeed true. But it is important to note that a failure to reject does not really mean that the null hypothesis is true, which is 50-50 of the sample size of the school likes English. Only that the test did not prove it to be false.
For the additional resources, the chi-square test usually refers to Pearson's chi-square and is also known as the chi-square goodness of fit test or the chi-square test for independence. We use this test when we have two categorical variables and want to determine whether there is a significant association between the two variables.
Hello everyone, good morning. I'm Trisha Mayonaya, the last reporter of Chi-Square, and I am assigned to recap the lesson. So, unsa man ang relationships hypothesis, alternative man o null hypothesis sa Chi-Square test. So, let's find out. Chi-square test is a statistical test commonly used to compare observed data we would expect to obtain according to a specific hypothesis. So, ang iyang purpose ani is to determine if ang difference between observed data is due to chance or kanang due sa relationship lang between variables nga imuhang gi-study. So, the first thing we do to find out the answer is to determine the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. So for example, we have null hypothesis that is equal frequencies. So that is they fit a uniform distribution. So alternative hypothesis is unequal frequencies or they don't fit a uniform distribution. So in the next slide, we have our chi-square distribution table, and in the first column we have degrees of freedom. So in the first row we have the area right of the critical value. So for example, to the right of the critical value for a right-tailed test is alpha. So the alpha is 0.05 or 0.05. And the degrees of freedom is 4. So using this column, and we have 4 degrees of freedom, and using this now, we could see that our critical value is 9.49. So if we have a scenario or problem, so we can use the formula chi squared is equal to sigma observed value minus expected value squared divided by expected value. So the chi-squared distribution is actually a series of distributions that vary in shape according to their degrees of freedom. So the chi-squared test is a hypothesis test designed to test for a statistically significant relationship between nominal and ordinal variables, organized in a bivariate table or atong akong gikuan nga distribution table. So in other words, it tells us whether two variables are independent to one another. So to obtain chi-square test statistically essentially summarizes the difference between the frequencies actually observed in a bivariate table and frequencies we would expect to see if there no relationship between two variables. The chi-square test is sensitive to sample size. So the chi-square test cannot establish a causal relationship between two variables. So we let's go back to the first slide. So we have point 1. So a hypothesis is an assumption, an idea that is proposed for the sake of argument so that it can be tested to see if it might be true. So ang population or parameter which may or may not be true. So a hypothesis to be tested is kanang all chi-square tests have the same general null and research hypothesis. So in point 2, failing the reject null hypothesis means you don't have enough evidence to reject its statement or prove it wrong. So the main point here is you know how to calculate the chi-square value and compare it to your critical value in order whether you should reject or not reject the null hypothesis.
So that's the end of our report. Thank you, everyone.